The strongest marriages are not destroyed by lies first, but by the stories people tell themselves before hearing the truth. Claire Bennett repeated those words silently as she placed the final dinner plate onto the long walnut dining table inside the elegant Manhattan townhouse she had shared with her billionaire husband for nearly 13 years. Soft candlelight reflected across polished crystal glasses while the aroma of rosemary chicken, roasted vegetables, and freshly baked bread filled the quiet dining room. Every detail looked perfect, yet nothing about the evening felt ordinary. Outside, autumn rain traced gentle lines across the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Inside, Claire carefully adjusted a folded linen napkin for a third guest. Most wives would have confronted the woman everyone whispered about. Others might have hired an attorney or packed a suitcase before demanding answers. Claire had chosen something no one expected. She had invited the woman to dinner. Earlier that afternoon she had stared at the business card resting on her kitchen counter for almost an hour before finally picking up her phone. The number belonged to Olivia Hayes, the woman neighbors believed had become far too familiar with Ethan Bennett. For months Claire had noticed the quiet changes. Ethan left the office every Thursday evening an hour earlier than usual. He sometimes ignored phone calls during dinner before quietly stepping outside to return them. Once, she had watched him leave a downtown cafe where Olivia stood waiting beneath a black umbrella. They had smiled warmly before walking in opposite directions. There had been no embrace, no hidden affection, only a conversation she could not hear. Unfortunately, gossip never needed facts to become convincing. Their names began appearing together in conversations at charity events, business luncheons, and neighborhood gatherings. Claire smiled politely every time someone hinted that wealthy men often lived by different rules. She never defended Ethan publicly because she realized she no longer understood what she herself believed. When Olivia answered the phone earlier that afternoon, her voice sounded calm and surprisingly kind. Claire introduced herself without hesitation. A brief silence followed. Then she said the words that even surprised her own heart. "Would you join me for dinner tonight?" Another pause. Olivia did not sound frightened. She did not sound guilty. She simply asked, "Will Ethan be there?" Claire looked toward the empty driveway outside her window. "He does not know I am inviting you." Olivia quietly exhaled before answering with unexpected sincerity. "Then I will come." Now, only minutes before 7 o'clock, Claire glanced once more toward the untouched third-place setting. She wondered whether she had made the bravest decision of her life or the most painful mistake. Upstairs, Ethan remained inside his downtown office finishing what he had described as one final meeting before coming home. At least, that was what he believed his evening would hold. The doorbell suddenly echoed through the silent house. Claire stood perfectly still for one long heartbeat before walking toward the entrance. As she opened the front door, she found Olivia Hayes standing beneath the porch light wearing a simple navy coat, carrying no expensive handbag, no dramatic expression, and no trace of arrogance. Instead, she held a small sealed envelope carefully in both hands, as though protecting something far more valuable than paper. She looked directly into Claire's eyes and offered a respectful smile filled with quiet nervousness. "Thank you for inviting me," Olivia said softly. "I have been hoping this conversation would happen for a very long time." Claire stepped aside and welcomed Olivia into the house without another word. The front door closed softly behind them, shutting out the sound of rain while leaving an even heavier silence inside the elegant townhouse. Olivia carefully removed her navy coat and placed it across one arm before looking around the beautifully decorated dining room. Nothing about her expression suggested triumph or confidence. Instead, she appeared deeply respectful, almost uncomfortable to be standing inside another woman's home under such extraordinary circumstances. Claire noticed that immediately. It was not the behavior she had imagined after months of whispered rumors. She gestured toward the dining table. "Please have a seat." Olivia nodded gratefully and quietly placed the sealed envelope beside her plate. Claire could not help noticing that the envelope had been opened and sealed again several times. The edges showed faint signs of careful handling, as though whatever rested inside had been read many times before. Neither woman reached for it. Claire served dinner with steady hands despite the storm of unanswered questions filling her thoughts. The sound of silverware against fine china became the only conversation for nearly a full minute. Finally Claire broke the silence. "You know people believe you and my husband are having an affair." Olivia lowered her fork slowly without showing anger or surprise. She looked directly into Claire's eyes before answering with remarkable honesty. "Yes. I know exactly what people believe." Claire waited for a denial that never immediately came. Instead, Olivia quietly added, "I also know why they believe it." The answer only deepened the mystery. Claire studied every movement across the table. Olivia wore no expensive jewelry except for a simple silver necklace holding a small circular pendant. It looked worn from years of daily use rather than recent luxury. There was no wedding ring on her hand, only a faint pale mark where one had once rested. Claire had expected someone glamorous enough to attract a billionaire's attention. Instead she found a woman whose quiet dignity seemed entirely untouched by wealth. "Why did you accept my invitation?" Claire finally asked. Olivia smiled gently. "Because hiding from you would have made everything worse." She glanced briefly toward the envelope. "And because I have hoped for a chance to explain something for a very long time." Claire looked at the sealed envelope. "What is inside?" Olivia gently rested one hand upon it. "Something Ethan wanted you to see one day." Claire immediately looked up. "My husband gave that to you?" Olivia slowly shook her head. "No." She paused before choosing her words carefully. "He does not even know I still have it." Before Claire could ask another question, her phone vibrated quietly beside her plate. The screen displayed Ethan's name. She answered calmly. "Hi." Ethan's familiar voice carried the warmth she had heard almost every evening for 13 years. "I just left the office. Traffic is slower because of the rain, but I should be home in about 20 minutes. Claire glanced across the table at Olivia, who lowered her eyes respectfully and remained completely silent. "Drive carefully," Claire replied before ending the call. As the room fell quiet once again, Olivia took a slow breath. "Claire, there is one thing I need you to understand before Ethan walks through that door." She gently slid the sealed envelope toward the center of the table but kept her fingertips resting upon it. "I did not come into your husband's life to take anything away from you." Her voice softened almost to a whisper. "I came because many years ago he made a promise to someone who could no longer keep one for himself." Claire remained perfectly still after Olivia's final sentence. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping softly against the tall windows while the warm glow of candlelight reflected across the untouched dinner plates. "A promise." The words lingered in the quiet dining room with unexpected weight. Claire had imagined countless explanations during the sleepless nights that had led to this evening, yet none of them had begun with a promise. She looked toward the sealed envelope resting between them. "Who made the promise?" she asked quietly. Olivia lowered her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Ethan did." Claire's heartbeat quickened, but Olivia immediately continued before fear could return. "Not to me." She gently touched the silver pendant resting against her necklace. "To my older brother." Claire noticed that every time Olivia mentioned her brother, her voice softened with unmistakable affection. There was no hesitation, no rehearsed performance, only genuine remembrance. "What was your brother's name?" Claire asked. Olivia smiled sadly. "Daniel Hayes." The name meant nothing to Claire, yet the emotion behind it certainly did. Olivia slowly reached into her handbag and removed a faded photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. She carefully placed it beside the unopened envelope. The picture showed 3 young men standing shoulder to shoulder on the shore of a quiet lake beneath a bright summer sky. They looked no older than 22. One of them was unmistakably Ethan, smiling with the carefree confidence of someone who had not yet become one of the country's youngest billionaires. Beside him stood a young man with the same warm eyes Olivia carried. Claire quietly realized she was looking at Daniel. "They were best friends," Olivia explained. "Closer than brothers." Claire studied the photograph without touching it. The joy on those young faces felt impossible to fake. Before she could ask another question, the sound of tires rolling across wet pavement echoed from outside. Both women instinctively turned toward the front window. A familiar black sedan slowly entered the driveway before stopping beneath the covered entrance. Ethan had arrived. Olivia quietly closed her eyes for a brief second, almost as though preparing herself for something she had hoped would happen and feared at the same time. Claire noticed that Olivia did not appear excited. She appeared deeply anxious. The front door unlocked only moments later. Ethan stepped inside carrying his leather briefcase, shaking a few drops of rain from his coat before looking toward the dining room with his usual warm smile. "I hope I did not keep you waiting too long," he called naturally. Then he walked into the room. His smile disappeared instantly. His eyes moved from Claire to Olivia and finally settled upon the familiar sealed envelope resting at the center of the table. For several long seconds no one spoke. Ethan looked as though every carefully protected secret from the past had suddenly appeared before him all at once. He slowly placed his briefcase on the floor without taking his eyes off the envelope. "Olivia," he said quietly, his voice filled not with anger but genuine surprise. "How did this happen?" Olivia looked toward Claire before answering with complete honesty. "Your wife invited me to dinner." Ethan turned to Claire, confusion and concern crossing his face together. Claire met his gaze calmly. "I was tired of listening to rumors," she said softly. "I decided it was finally time to hear the truth from the people who actually know it." Ethan looked once more at the unopened envelope before taking a slow breath. Then, he said quietly, pulling out the empty chair at the table, "I think tonight is finally the night every promise stops hiding behind silence." The silence that settled over the dining room felt heavier than the autumn rain outside. Ethan remained standing beside his chair, his eyes fixed on the familiar envelope resting between the candles as though it carried the weight of years he could no longer postpone. Claire watched him carefully. She had expected defensiveness, perhaps even anger, but instead she saw something entirely different. Regret. Not the regret of being caught, but the regret of allowing a secret to grow so large that it had nearly become stronger than trust itself. Ethan slowly removed his raincoat and draped it across the back of his chair before finally sitting down. He folded his hands together and looked first at Claire, then at Olivia. "I owe both of you an apology," he said quietly. "I believed I was protecting someone. I never realized I was slowly hurting someone else." Claire remained calm. "Then tell me why." Ethan nodded once. "I will." Before he could continue, Olivia gently pushed the sealed envelope toward him. "I never opened it after the last time," she said softly. "I thought it belonged to you." Ethan slowly shook his head. "No. It was never meant to belong to me." He carefully turned the envelope toward Claire instead. "It has always belonged to my wife. I simply did not know when I would have the courage to give it to her." Claire looked down at the worn paper. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were only 4 words in unfamiliar handwriting. "If anything happens to me." Her heart tightened instantly. Ethan noticed the expression on her face. "Those words were written 15 years ago," he explained quietly. "Long before I met you." Olivia reached into her handbag once again and removed another small item. This time it was a weathered stainless steel keychain holding 2 tiny mountain-shaped charms worn smooth from years of use. She placed it beside the photograph. "Daniel carried this everywhere," she whispered. "After he was gone, Ethan kept one. I kept the other." Claire looked from the keychain to the smiling young man in the old photograph. Every object on the table seemed connected by memories rather than secrets. Ethan finally spoke again. "Daniel Hayes was the kind of friend people are lucky to meet once in a lifetime. We built dreams together before either of us had careers, money, or titles. We promised that success would never change who we were." His voice softened. "Life had other plans." Claire listened without interrupting. Ethan continued, choosing each word carefully. "A few months before Daniel passed away, he gave me that envelope. He laughed while handing it to me and said I should never open it unless something happened that prevented him from coming home himself. I told him he was being dramatic. Ethan paused briefly, looking down at the envelope with quiet sadness. I wish I had been right. Olivia lowered her eyes as memories quietly returned. The room remained filled with compassion rather than accusation. Claire slowly reached for the envelope but did not break the seal. Something inside told her that once it was opened, every assumption she had carried for months would disappear forever. She looked back toward Ethan. You have visited Olivia all these months because of Daniel, have you not? Ethan answered immediately. Yes. There was no hesitation in his voice. Everything I have done began with a promise I made to the man who trusted me more than anyone else. Claire rested her fingertips lightly against the envelope, realizing that the truth she had spent months searching for had never been hidden behind betrayal. It had been waiting patiently inside a letter written years before she ever became Ethan Bennett's wife. Claire held the sealed envelope carefully in both hands without opening it. The paper felt surprisingly heavy, not because of its weight but because of everything it represented. 15 years of silence rested behind a single fold of faded stationery. The candles flickered gently as the rain continued falling outside, wrapping the townhouse in a quiet stillness that seemed to separate this evening from the rest of the world. Ethan looked at Claire with calm sincerity. You deserve to know everything, he said softly. But before you read that letter, you need to understand the man who wrote it. Claire slowly nodded. Ethan glanced toward the old photograph lying beside the envelope. Daniel never measured people by money. When we met during our freshman year of college, neither of us had much. We shared textbooks, worked part-time jobs, and dreamed about futures that seemed impossibly far away. Whenever one of us succeeded, the other celebrated first. Olivia smiled faintly as she listened. My brother used to tell everyone that Ethan would become successful because he cared about people more than profits. Ethan lowered his eyes with quiet humility. He always believed in me more than I believed in myself. Claire noticed there was no pride in Ethan's voice, only gratitude. Olivia carefully lifted the photograph from the table. This was taken during our last family vacation together, she explained. A month later Daniel accepted a humanitarian engineering project overseas. Before leaving, he visited Ethan one final time. Ethan nodded slowly. He handed me that envelope and laughed when I told him nothing was going to happen. Then he said something I have never forgotten. Ethan paused for a moment before quietly repeating the words exactly as he remembered them. If life surprises me before it surprises you, promise me Olivia will never have to face the world believing she is completely alone. Claire listened in complete silence. Ethan continued. I promised him without hesitation because I never imagined I would actually need to keep that promise. Olivia gently rested the photograph back on the table. A few months later, Daniel's project was struck by a sudden natural disaster. He never came home. The room fell completely still. Claire instinctively reached across the table and gently placed her hand over Olivia's. Olivia smiled gratefully. Everything changed overnight, she said softly. I lost my brother. Ethan lost his closest friend. Ethan quietly added, the day I attended Daniel's memorial service, I opened the envelope for the first time. Claire looked down at the sealed paper resting before her. Then why is it still sealed now? Ethan offered a faint smile. Because that is not the original. Claire looked up in surprise. Olivia answered before Ethan could continue. Daniel wrote 2 identical letters. One was for Ethan. The second was for the woman Ethan would someday marry. Claire's eyes widened. Olivia gently slid the envelope a little closer. My brother believed the person who shared Ethan's life deserved to know why one promise would always remain part of his future. Ethan looked directly at Claire with complete honesty. I wanted to give it to you many times. Every year I told myself the moment was not right. Then the rumors began, and every week that passed made the conversation even harder to start. Claire rested her fingertips along the edge of the envelope without breaking the seal. She realized that what had once appeared to be the beginning of betrayal had quietly become the doorway to a story written years before their marriage ever existed. Somewhere inside that letter waited the final piece capable of explaining every Thursday evening, every whispered rumor, every silent sacrifice, and every choice Ethan had made in honor of a friendship that time had never diminished. Claire drew a slow breath before carefully breaking the seal. The sound of the paper opening seemed impossibly loud inside the silent dining room. Ethan and Olivia remained completely still, neither trying to interrupt the moment. Inside the envelope rested a single handwritten letter folded neatly into thirds. The ink had faded slightly with time, yet every word remained perfectly clear. Claire unfolded the pages and quietly began reading. "If you are reading this, then life has taken a path none of us wanted. Ethan, I know you. You are already blaming yourself for something you could never control. Stop. Instead, do the only thing that has ever made you who you are. Keep living with the same generous heart that made me proud to call you my brother." Claire paused for a moment before continuing. The room remained filled only with the gentle sound of rain against the windows. "One day you will meet someone extraordinary. She will become your wife, your best friend, and the person who teaches you that love grows stronger when it is shared honestly. If she is reading this letter beside you, then I want her to know something important. Please never think Olivia stands between your marriage. She stands beside the promise I asked Ethan to keep. I trust both of you long before you ever know each other." Claire slowly lowered the letter for just a second. Tears quietly gathered in her eyes before she continued reading. "Olivia has always been stronger than she believes, but even the strongest people should never have to carry grief completely alone. Ethan, help her whenever she truly needs it, but never take away her dignity. Do not rescue her from life. Simply remind her that family sometimes arrives through friendship instead of blood." Olivia quietly looked toward the table, unable to hide the emotion in her eyes. Ethan remained silent, remembering every promise he had spent years trying to honor. Claire continued reading the final page. "To the woman who shares Ethan's future, thank you for loving my brother after I no longer could. There may be days when his loyalty confuses you because he will always protect people before explaining himself. When those days come, I hope you choose one conversation before one conclusion. If you both remember that kindness deserves trust, then my promise will never become a burden. It will become part of your family's story." Claire carefully folded the letter back together, unable to speak for several long moments. Every rumor, every unexplained Thursday evening, every whispered conversation, every quiet act of generosity suddenly fit together with perfect clarity. Ethan finally broke the silence. "I carried the original letter everywhere for years. When I married you, I asked Daniel's parents for permission to copy the second one because I wanted you to have it someday. Every anniversary I almost gave it to you. Every time I convinced myself I should wait until life felt less complicated." Claire looked gently into his eyes. "Instead, life became more complicated because we stopped talking." Ethan nodded with complete honesty. "Yes." Olivia quietly reached into her handbag one final time and placed a small leather folder beside the letter. "There is something else you both deserve to see," she said softly. "It explains why Ethan continued visiting me after I no longer needed financial help." Claire looked toward the folder as Olivia slowly opened it, revealing documents that would uncover another part of Daniel's legacy, one that neither she nor Ethan had expected to revisit on this unforgettable evening. Claire quietly looked through the documents Olivia had placed on the table. They were not secret love letters, hidden photographs, or private messages. Instead, they contained legal agreements, annual financial reports, and charitable trust records spanning more than a decade. Every page carried one familiar signature. Ethan Bennett. Claire slowly turned another page and found a letter from an independent law firm confirming the creation of the Daniel Hayes Family Education Trust. The document explained that the trust had been established 12 years earlier with a single purpose. It would provide scholarships, emergency assistance, and educational opportunities for the families of engineers and humanitarian volunteers who lost their lives while serving others. Claire looked up in surprise. I have never heard of this foundation. Ethan offered a quiet smile. That was intentional. Olivia gently continued the explanation. The trust has never carried Ethan's name. It carries my brother's because Ethan wanted every family helped by it to remember Daniel instead of the man who funded it. Claire continued reading. Every annual report showed anonymous donations that had quietly grown larger as Ethan's company became more successful. The figures represented millions of dollars invested over many years, yet nowhere did Ethan publicly claim credit for the project. Olivia carefully opened another section of the folder. Inside rested dozens of handwritten thank you notes from families across the country. One mother thanked the trust for helping her daughter attend nursing school after losing her husband during an overseas relief mission. Another father described how emergency assistance allowed his children to remain in their home after an unexpected tragedy. Every letter began with gratitude toward the Daniel Hayes Family Education Trust. None mentioned Ethan Bennett. Claire gently looked toward her husband. You never told anyone. Ethan quietly shook his head. The promise was never about recognition. Olivia smiled warmly. Every Thursday evening Ethan visited because we reviewed scholarship applications together. My brother believed education could change lives. Ethan refused to let that dream disappear. Claire suddenly remembered every Thursday dinner interrupted by unexpected meetings, every unexplained drive across the city, every whispered conversation she had quietly misunderstood. None of those evenings had been stolen from their marriage. They had been devoted to protecting Daniel's dream. Ethan reached into the folder and removed one final document. There is one reason I could never walk away. Claire accepted the page. It was the original trust agreement signed years earlier. At the very bottom appeared one handwritten sentence beneath Daniel's signature. If this dream survives longer than I do, let it belong to every family that still believes kindness is stronger than loss. Claire slowly looked back toward Ethan. You kept every word. Ethan nodded. I tried. Olivia gently added, sometimes he came after 12-hour board meetings. Sometimes he arrived exhausted. Sometimes he insisted we postpone because he wanted every scholarship decision to be completely fair. He never missed a single year. Claire smiled softly through grateful tears. The rumors that had spread through charity events and business circles suddenly seemed painfully small compared to the quiet legacy sitting across the dinner table. She finally understood why Olivia had accepted the invitation without fear. She had never carried the secret of an affair. She had carried the responsibility of protecting a promise made between two young friends whose bond had survived far beyond one lifetime. As the candles continued burning quietly between them, Claire realized that the greatest love stories are not measured by dramatic declarations but by ordinary acts of faithfulness repeated year after year, even when almost no one knows they exist. The three of them remained seated around the dining table long after dinner had grown cold. Outside, the rain slowly eased into a quiet mist, and the city lights reflected across the wet streets below. Inside the townhouse, however, another kind of storm had already passed. Claire gently gathered the letters, photographs, and trust documents into careful stacks, handling each page with a respect she had not known they deserved only hours earlier. She finally understood why Ethan had never looked nervous whenever people whispered about Olivia. He had looked saddened because he knew the truth could never be defended without breaking a promise that was never his alone to reveal. Claire quietly looked toward Olivia. How did all of those rumors begin? Olivia offered a small, almost embarrassed smile. Probably the same way most rumors begin. Someone noticed us having coffee after a scholarship meeting. Another person saw Ethan helping me carry boxes into the education center. Soon every ordinary moment became something dramatic because people preferred exciting stories over ordinary kindness. Ethan slowly nodded. I kept believing the rumors would disappear on their own. Claire met his eyes gently. Instead, silence gave them room to grow. Ethan accepted the truth without argument. You are right. Olivia carefully folded Daniel's photograph back into its protective sleeve before speaking again. There is something neither of you knows. Claire looked up with quiet curiosity. Several months ago I accepted a position in Seattle. Ethan smiled warmly. You finally accepted it. Olivia nodded. The education trust has become stable. The board no longer needs me every Thursday evening, and thanks to everything Daniel dreamed of and everything Ethan built, the foundation can continue without my constant involvement. Claire noticed genuine happiness in Ethan's expression. There was no sadness at the news, only quiet pride. Olivia continued softly. That is another reason I agreed to dinner tonight. I wanted to leave knowing there would never be distance between the two people Daniel trusted most. Claire reached across the table and gently touched Olivia's hand. You never stood between us. Olivia smiled through grateful emotion. Thank you. Ethan quietly stood and walked toward the dining room cabinet before returning with a small wooden keepsake box. He placed it beside the folded letter. I plan to give this to you after the board approved the transition next month, he said to Olivia. She carefully opened the box and immediately covered her mouth in surprise. Inside rested the original brass compass Daniel had carried during their college hiking trips, polished carefully after years of preservation. A tiny engraving circled its edge. Keep moving toward what matters most. Olivia's eyes filled with tears as she lifted the compass into her hands. I thought this had been lost. Ethan smiled gently. I promised I would return it when your brother's work no longer depended on mine. Claire watched the exchange quietly, realizing she was witnessing the final chapter of a promise that had begun long before she entered Ethan's life. The compass, like the letter, had never been hidden because of deception. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to return home. As the evening drew to a close, Olivia put on her navy coat and prepared to leave. Before opening the front door, she turned back toward Claire with sincere gratitude. Tonight could have become a night of anger. Claire smiled warmly. Instead, it became a night of truth. Ethan opened the door while the cool autumn air drifted gently inside. As Olivia walked toward her car beneath the clearing sky, Claire quietly slipped Daniel's letter back into its envelope, understanding that some promises do not end when they are fulfilled. They simply become part of the family that chooses to carry them forward together. After Olivia's car disappeared into the quiet Manhattan night, Claire closed the front door and stood for a long moment with her hand resting against the polished wood. The house looked exactly the same as it had only a few hours earlier. The candle still flickered gently on the dining table. 3 wine glasses remained exactly where they had been placed before dinner began. Yet everything had changed. Ethan quietly gathered the empty plates and carried them toward the kitchen. Claire followed without speaking. When he reached for the faucet, she gently touched his arm. Leave them for tonight, she said softly. Ethan looked at her with tired eyes that carried more relief than exhaustion. He nodded, and together they returned to the living room where the city lights shimmered beyond the rain-speckled windows. Claire held Daniel's letter once more before carefully placing it inside the wooden keepsake box beside the brass compass. I understand why you protected his promise, she said quietly. But I wish you had trusted me enough to carry it with you. Ethan lowered his head. That is the part one regret most. He paused before continuing with complete honesty. Every Thursday I told myself I would explain everything when the trust reached the next milestone. Then another scholarship deadline arrived, another board meeting followed, another family needed help, and I convinced myself waiting one more week would somehow protect everyone. Instead, I slowly created distance between the person whose trust mattered most. Claire listened carefully, recognizing that silence had become its own mistake. I also made one, she admitted. I watched pieces of your life without asking you to explain them. I allowed other people's stories to become louder than our own. Ethan smiled sadly. Perhaps we were both trying to protect something and forgot to protect each other. The words settled gently between them. The following Monday morning Claire accompanied Ethan to the headquarters of the Daniel Hayes Family Education Trust for the first time. The modest office occupied only one floor of an older brick building a few miles from downtown, far removed from the glass towers where Ethan usually worked. There were no large signs displaying his company logo, no photographs celebrating wealthy donors, and no media waiting outside. Instead, volunteers quietly organized scholarship applications while counselors met with families in comfortable meeting rooms. Claire walked through the office slowly, noticing framed letters from grateful students lining one hallway. One young engineer thanked the trust for helping him finish college after losing his father during an international relief mission. A nurse described how a scholarship allowed her to serve rural communities exactly as her late mother had dreamed. Every story reflected Daniel's belief that kindness should continue creating opportunities long after tragedy. Ethan introduced Claire simply as his wife. No one treated him like a celebrity. The volunteers welcomed him with the familiarity reserved for someone who had quietly worked beside them for years. Claire watched him carry donated books into a storage room, laugh with longtime staff members, and personally greet every student arriving for afternoon interviews. She realized she was seeing a part of her husband that had never appeared in business magazines or charity galas. This was not the billionaire admired for building companies. This was the young friend who had refused to let another friend's dream disappear. As they prepared to leave that evening, Claire looked back toward the small conference room where Daniel's photograph hung beside the trust's mission statement. She smiled quietly, understanding that the greatest legacy Ethan had ever built was never measured in wealth. It had always been measured in promises faithfully kept, lives quietly changed, and the courage to choose compassion long after everyone else had stopped watching. Several weeks passed, and for the first time in many months, silence no longer lived inside the Bennett home. It had been replaced by conversations that stretched late into the evening, shared breakfasts before busy mornings, and small moments that reminded Claire and Ethan why they had chosen one another years before. Trust was returning, not because the past had been erased, but because the truth had finally been given room to breathe. One crisp Friday morning, Claire stood beside Ethan as they reviewed invitations for the upcoming annual fundraising dinner hosted by the Daniel Hayes Family Education Trust. Unlike previous years, the board had voted to introduce a new scholarship initiative honoring volunteers who dedicated their lives to humanitarian engineering. Olivia, preparing for her move to Seattle, had encouraged the board to make this year's gathering a celebration of Daniel's vision instead of another quiet administrative event. Claire smiled as she read through the guest list. Teachers, students, former scholarship recipients, community leaders, and families whose lives had been transformed through the trust would all be attending. What surprised her most was one additional recommendation from the board. Several members believed it was finally time to publicly acknowledge Ethan's years of anonymous leadership. Ethan immediately shook his head. The evening belongs to Daniel. Claire gently placed her hand over his. Perhaps honoring your faithfulness does not take anything away from Daniel. It simply tells people that promises still matter. Ethan looked thoughtfully toward the framed photograph resting on the bookshelf in his office. It showed Daniel smiling beside the lake many years earlier, the same photograph Claire had first seen on the dinner table. If people learn about the trust, Ethan said quietly, I only want them to remember why it exists. Claire smiled warmly. Then that is exactly what they will remember. A few days later, the annual dinner filled a beautiful community ballroom overlooking the Hudson River. There were no extravagant decorations or displays of wealth. Fresh white flowers lined the tables, students performed gentle piano music, and walls displayed photographs of scholarship recipients pursuing careers in medicine, engineering, education, and public service. Claire walked through the room greeting families who shared heartfelt stories of hope rather than hardship. One young woman proudly introduced her parents before explaining that the trust had allowed her to become the first college graduate in her family. Another scholarship recipient thanked Ethan for believing in students he had never even met. Ethan accepted every conversation with quiet humility, always redirecting attention toward Daniel's legacy and the volunteers who managed the foundation every day. As the evening progressed, the chairperson of the board unexpectedly stepped onto the stage. She smiled toward Ethan before addressing the audience. For more than a decade, one individual has asked us never to mention his name. Tonight we respectfully disagree because true generosity deserves honest gratitude. Ethan immediately looked toward Claire with quiet uncertainty. Claire simply smiled reassuringly. The chairperson continued by telling the story of a young college student who had made a promise to his best friend and had quietly fulfilled that promise year after year without seeking recognition. The audience listened in complete silence. Some wiped away tears as photographs of Daniel, scholarship recipients, and volunteer projects appeared across the large screen. Claire watched Ethan lower his head with humble gratitude rather than pride. In that beautiful moment, she realized that the rumors which had once threatened to define their marriage had become completely powerless beside the simple truth. Kindness, faithfully lived over many years, always shines brighter than misunderstanding once people are finally willing to see it. When the applause finally faded, Ethan remained standing on the stage for a brief moment before walking slowly to the podium. He did not begin with statistics about the foundation or stories about business success. Instead, he looked across the audience filled with students, families, volunteers, and longtime supporters, then smiled with quiet gratitude. "The person you are honoring tonight would have been uncomfortable receiving this recognition," he began gently. Soft laughter spread through the ballroom because everyone understood he was speaking about himself. Ethan continued, "The truth is that I have never considered this foundation my achievement. It belongs to a young man who believed kindness should continue long after we are gone. My responsibility was simply to keep one promise." He stepped away from the prepared speech resting on the podium. "If there is one lesson I have learned, it is that promises are strongest when they are shared with honesty. I kept one promise faithfully, but I failed another. I did not fully trust my wife with the burden I was carrying, and silence nearly cost me the most important relationship in my life." Claire looked up at him, her eyes filled with quiet emotion. Ethan smiled warmly toward her before continuing. "Claire taught me that protecting someone should never require shutting out the people who love us most. Real trust grows through difficult conversations, not perfect appearances." The audience responded with gentle applause. Ethan then invited Claire to join him on the stage. Surprised, she hesitated for only a moment before walking toward him. He reached for her hand with the same quiet tenderness that had first made her fall in love with him years earlier. Standing beside him beneath the warm lights, Claire looked across the audience and recognized Olivia seated near the front with members of the foundation board. Olivia smiled proudly before offering a small nod of encouragement. Claire stepped closer to the microphone. "Several weeks ago," she said softly, "I believed I understood my own marriage. The truth was that I understood only the rumors surrounding it. I allowed unanswered questions to become assumptions, and assumptions almost became permanent conclusions. Tonight I want to thank every family represented here because your stories reminded me that compassion often works quietly, beyond the attention of the world." She paused briefly before continuing. "I also want to thank the woman many people misunderstood." Claire turned toward Olivia with genuine warmth. "Your courage, dignity, and patience protected not only your brother's dream but also my family's future. I hope everyone here remembers that appearances rarely reveal the entire story." The ballroom filled with heartfelt applause as Olivia stood respectfully, clearly moved by Claire's words. After the program ended, dozens of scholarship recipients gathered to thank the volunteers and board members personally. One young engineering student approached Ethan carrying a folded acceptance letter from a graduate research program. "I wanted you to know," he said with a grateful smile, "that I would never have reached this day without the Daniel Hayes Scholarship." Ethan congratulated him warmly before quietly introducing him to Claire. As they listened to the young man describe his dreams of designing safer infrastructure for disaster relief teams, Claire suddenly understood the true measure of Daniel's legacy. It was no longer contained within one promise, one friendship, or one family. It now lived inside countless futures that had been shaped by ordinary acts of generosity repeated faithfully over many years. Standing beside Ethan while students laughed, families embraced, and volunteers celebrated together, Claire realized that healing had quietly replaced every fear that had once entered her heart on the evening she invited a stranger to dinner. In the weeks that followed the foundation celebration, life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. The Bennett home was no longer a place where unanswered questions quietly lingered behind polite smiles. Instead, every evening became an opportunity to share the ordinary moments that often matter most. Claire and Ethan found themselves talking over breakfast, calling each other during busy afternoons, and ending each day with the simple habit of asking not only where they had been but how they had truly felt. Trust, Claire realized, was not rebuilt through one dramatic conversation. It returned through hundreds of honest ones. Olivia completed her transition to Seattle at the beginning of winter. Before leaving New York, she visited the townhouse one final time, not as an unexpected guest but as a welcomed friend. She carried no envelopes or legal documents this time. Instead, she brought a carefully framed photograph taken during the recent foundation celebration. It showed Ethan, Claire, Olivia, several scholarship recipients, and the volunteer team standing together beneath the banner honoring Daniel Hayes. The smiles in the photograph reflected relief, gratitude, and genuine friendship rather than obligation. Claire immediately placed the frame on the bookshelf in their living room beside the wooden keepsake box that now held Daniel's letter and the restored brass compass. Looking at the display, Olivia smiled softly. "Daniel would have loved seeing all of you together." Ethan nodded. "He is still bringing people together." Before leaving, Olivia hugged Claire warmly. "Thank you for choosing a dinner invitation instead of believing every rumor." Claire returned the embrace with sincere affection. "Thank you for accepting it." As the months passed, the Daniel Hayes Family Education Trust expanded its scholarship program into several additional states. Former recipients returned as volunteer mentors, helping new students navigate college applications, internships, and careers devoted to serving others. Claire accepted an invitation to join the Foundation's advisory committee, contributing her experience in nonprofit leadership while ensuring families always felt welcomed with dignity and compassion. She often smiled when she realized that the organization she had once feared had become one of the greatest blessings in her own life. One spring afternoon, Claire and Ethan visited the lakeside where the old photograph of Daniel had been taken many years earlier. The water remained peaceful beneath a clear blue sky, and fresh wildflowers covered the nearby hillside. Ethan carried the brass compass in his jacket pocket. Claire carried the framed copy of Daniel's handwritten letter. Together they sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the lake. After several peaceful minutes, Ethan removed the compass and placed it gently between them. "For years I believed keeping a promise meant carrying it alone," he admitted softly. Claire intertwined her fingers with his. "Now you know better." Ethan smiled. "Now I know promises become stronger when the people we love are allowed to carry them with us." Claire looked across the calm water, remembering the woman she had been on the evening she set a third plate at her dining table. She had expected confrontation. She had prepared herself for heartbreak. Instead, she had discovered a story of friendship, sacrifice, integrity, and quiet generosity that reached far beyond suspicion. The rumors that once seemed so powerful had completely disappeared, replaced by a legacy that continued changing lives every single day. As the afternoon sun reflected across the lake, Claire realized that truth does not always arrive with dramatic revelations. Sometimes it arrives through patience, honest conversation, and the courage to open a letter that has been waiting many years to remind every heart involved that love is always strongest when it chooses understanding before judgment. 1 year later, on a bright spring afternoon, the Daniel Hayes Family Education Trust welcomed students, volunteers, and families from across the country to celebrate another graduating class whose futures had been transformed through opportunity instead of circumstance. Fresh white flowers lined the entrance to the community center, laughter drifted through the open courtyard, and dozens of young scholarship recipients proudly greeted one another like lifelong friends. Claire Bennett stood beside Ethan beneath the shade of a flowering maple tree, watching the gathering with quiet gratitude. It was difficult to believe that only a year earlier she had prepared a dinner table expecting heartbreak. Instead, that single evening had become the beginning of a deeper marriage, a lasting friendship, and a renewed understanding of what true love actually required. Near the entrance, a bronze plaque bearing Daniel Hayes' name reflected the afternoon sunlight. Beneath it were words every visitor paused to read. "Kindness becomes a legacy when one promise inspires another." Claire smiled as several students stopped to photograph the inscription before entering the building. They had never met Daniel, yet his life continued guiding people he would never know. Ethan gently slipped his hand into Claire's. "He would have enjoyed today," he said softly. Claire nodded. "I think he already does." Just then Olivia approached from across the courtyard, having flown in from Seattle for the annual celebration. She looked happy, confident, and completely at peace. She warmly embraced both Claire and Ethan before laughing as several scholarship recipients hurried over to greet her. Watching Olivia surrounded by grateful students, Claire remembered the frightened assumptions that had once filled her heart. The woman she had feared losing her marriage to had instead become someone she deeply admired. Later that afternoon, the newest scholarship recipients gathered for a group photograph beneath the foundation banner. Before the camera shutter clicked, one young engineering student raised his hand. "May I say something first?" Everyone smiled encouragingly. The student looked toward Ethan, Claire, and Olivia. "Most of us here have never met Daniel Hayes. Some of us never knew the people whose sacrifices made these scholarships possible. But because someone kept a promise, every one of us now has the chance to build lives that honor theirs. We hope to pass that kindness forward." The courtyard erupted into heartfelt applause. Claire quietly felt tears gathering once again, but this time they carried only gratitude. As the celebration came to an end, Ethan reached into the wooden presentation box resting beside the podium. Inside remained the original brass compass and a carefully preserved copy of Daniel's handwritten letter. They had become treasured symbols of the Foundation's history. Ethan looked toward the crowd before placing the compass inside a permanent glass display within the education center, ensuring future generations would understand that extraordinary legacies often begin with ordinary acts of loyalty. Claire then carefully placed Daniel's letter beside it. Together they stepped back and watched families gather around the display, reading the story that had quietly changed so many lives. As the sun slowly lowered across the peaceful courtyard, Claire realized the greatest surprise had never been what happened after she invited another woman to dinner. The greatest surprise was discovering that trust can be rebuilt, friendship can grow from misunderstanding, and love becomes strongest when people choose truth before judgment, compassion before suspicion, and conversation before conclusion. Walking hand in hand toward the waiting crowd, Claire and Ethan knew their story would never be remembered as one shaped by rumors. It would be remembered as one transformed by a promise faithfully kept, a marriage courageously restored, and a legacy of kindness that would continue guiding countless hearts for generations to come.